people who could not be here today. So my co-collaborators, Dr. Lara Cushing, who is on spring break with her family, and Nick Depsky and Yang Zhu. Yang Zhu's in China on a completely different time frame, so couldn't attend either. And Jesse Jager, another contributor to this project, who couldn't be here. So I want to have Ben and Scott introduce themselves first.
Hi,
You're on mute, Ben.
Ben Strauss, Climate Central CEO and Chief Scientist here, and have been involved in sea level research for more than a decade. Over to you, Scott.
Yeah, I'm Scott Culp. I'm the principal computational scientist at Climate Central. And I've, on this project, I've done a lot of the analysis, the exposure and vulnerability analysis.
Thanks, guys. And Ami, do you want to introduce yourself and pass it on?
Yeah, hi everyone. Good morning. My name is Ami Raval. I'm Policy and Research Director with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, or APEN. We're a grassroots environmental justice organization based in the Bay Area. I'll pass it to Lucas.
Hi everyone, Lucas Zucker. I'm the Policy and Communications Director at CAUSE. We're a social, economic, and environmental justice organization in the Central Coast region. This is my baby Amalia. Our whole family has COVID, so that's why we're here. Let's see, I'll pass it to Michael.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Rincon. My camera's off. I am the Water and Toxics Policy Manager at Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles. We are a EJ and public health organization based out of Los Angeles, and we work in collaboration with community organizations to uplift community-based solutions. And I will pass it to Linda.
Hi, I'm Linda Rudolph. I'm a physician that advises the Public Health Institute on climate health and equity issues. And I also do the same for the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, which is an organization that represents about 600,000 physicians in the US.
And Gurjeet?
Hi, my name is Gurjeet Kaur Singh, pronouns she, her, and I'm also with Asian Pacific Environmental Network, or APEN. Thank you.
And is Marta on? I can't see everybody here. Okay. Moving on. Segi, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Segi Karasaki, and I'm a graduate student research assistant on this project.
And Alik?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alik Berberian. I'm from UCLA, and I'm a graduate student researcher. Nice to see you all.
Okay. Did I forget anyone from the team that I can't see because there's too many Hollywood squares here? Okay. So I'm going to, I think Ami's going to launch us. So I'm going to share our screen.
And if it's helpful, Rachel, we can share screen. Gurjeet can do it.
That would be great.
Yeah, and I think to kick us off, we're gonna have the set of sort of advocates and researchers share, but we'll be starting with Michael to kick us off on the intro. So once we get slides, we can pass it to him.
Just one sec.
Looks great.
Great. Go for it.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Like I said, my name is Michael Rincon, and I am the Water Toxics Policy Manager at PSRLA. Thank you all for joining us today for our presentation on the Toxic Tides Project, which is a collaborative research effort that aims to depict the risks posed by sea level rise, tides, and storm surge on environmental justice communities. In California, our communities are living at the convergence of multiple crises. growing economic inequality and the housing crisis, intensifying climate disasters such as wildfires and heat waves, and the lingering COVID-19 pandemic. EJ communities also experience chronic burdens from historic pollution burdens. Amidst these acute and very present burdens, we also have to plan for a climate future that will present new challenges, one of which is sea level rise and the way it will worsen existing cumulative health burdens. Next slide, please. The Toxic Tides Project, as I mentioned, was a collaborative effort amongst community-based partners and academic researchers. Our research team consisted of the UC Berkeley Sustainable and Health Equity Lab, UCLA Fielding School of Public Health, and Climate Central. Our community-based partners included Asian Pacific Environmental Network, also known as APEN, Central Coast Alliance for a Sustainable Economy, or CAUSE, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles, or PSRLA, and the Public Health Institute, and We Act for Environmental Justice. Next slide, please. The purpose of today's presentation is to share findings and recommendations with state agencies and legislative stakeholders on the environmental impacts of sea level rise and flooding of hazardous sites in California. By the end, we will have provided an introduction to the Toxic Tides Project and mapping tool, provided an understanding of the threats posed by flooding of hazardous sites on EJ communities, and have shared recommended actions and next steps uplifted by stakeholders. Next slide. This will be our agenda for today, which is kind of what I mentioned. Next slide. And now I will pass it to Linda, who will provide an introduction to the Toxic Tides Project.
Thanks, Michael. I just want to put this in a little bit of context. We're clearly seeing the health impacts of climate change in California and around the world, and these impacts are accelerating. Health experts around the world see climate change as the greatest health challenge of this century. Climate health impacts exacerbate persistent underlying health inequities and result in disproportionate climate health impacts in communities of color and low-income communities. Next. About 145,000 Californians live in areas projected to experience flooding events by 2100. There are 400 hazardous facilities, including power plants, refineries, industrial facilities, and hazardous waste sites in those areas. And these facilities are disproportionately located in poor communities and communities of color that already are experiencing health inequities. Next. Unfortunately, there's been very little discussion of the potential risks of exposure to toxics due to flooding from sea level rise, rising groundwater levels, or storm surges. And that's why the Toxic Tides Project is so important. With an understanding of the intersection of sea level rise, hazardous facilities, health equity, and environmental justice, communities can take and advocate for targeted action to prevent the most adverse impacts. Next. The Toxic Tides Project set out basically to do three things. First, to characterize the threats posed by sea level rise and the flooding of hazardous sites to socially disadvantaged populations. Next, to create an online mapping tool that visually depicts toxic facilities at risk of flooding due to sea level rise and associated socioeconomic conditions. And finally, to share those findings with advocates and decision makers in order to develop climate resilient strategies, policies, and resources to protect vulnerable communities. I want to thank APEN and the research team for this important work, and we all look forward to hearing your initial thoughts about how these results can inform the work of your agencies. Now I'll turn it over to Lucas and Amalia to tell you more about the community partnership process.
Thank you. Hopefully this will be mostly me and not too much Amalia. But one of the most exciting parts of this project really is the collaboration between, community-based organizations who are deeply rooted in many years of environmental justice organizing and advocacy, like APEN, PSRLA, CAUSE, and other organizations you heard about, and the scholars at UCLA and Berkeley who provided some of the really incredible just technical and quantitative research and data visualization in this mapping tool. So I think this kind of approach is unique and is really promoted by Strategic Growth Council, and provides real accountability to the most impacted communities. It also provides a ground truthing so that data and scientific analysis is actually connected to the lived experiences of folks who understand these issues from their own neighborhoods and communities, and make sure that research is actually accessible to those community members and usable for advocates and policymakers, and not just kind of existing in a siloed academic environment. Next slide, please. So community advocates participated in different phases of this project. We had an advisory committee that provided regular guidance and feedback to researchers in an iterative process. So there was the kind of overall study design, the research variables, the usability of the end product, and the dissemination strategy afterwards. Next slide. And so the community advisory process really led to some tangible changes and additions to this mapping tool. There were social indicators, like, for example, the share of a population that are renters in a census tract, which may indicate whether people are more likely to have insurance, maybe they're more likely to get notifications about toxic sites nearby them, depending on whether they're renters or homeowners. Political representation and voter turnout, so communities that might say, because they're heavily undocumented, not have a lot of political representation, in kind of advancing solutions to potential risks from toxic sites and sea level rise. There were also additions of certain facilities that weren't in the original version. So, for example, naval bases and oil drilling sites were facilities added as a result of input from the Community Advisory Committee. And as well, the advisory committee really advocated for layering these two data visualizations over each other, right? So that it was really easy to see together both the kind of social vulnerability as well as the risks that folks were facing in one map, and really make that design as accessible as possible, especially to folks who are not as tech literate or kind of academically inclined. We also work to help create the case studies that you can see on the website, where we talk about some of the history of communities. So how did we get there? For example, the interior of the Bay Area does not just coincidentally have a lot of low-income and working class Black and brown communities right next to toxic industrial sites along the Bayshore. That was a result of a history of redlining and a history of kind of industrial development in those communities, coming from the shipyards in World War II. Talking about the solutions. So, in a community like mine, and in South Oxnard, you've got a Superfund site on the coast at risk of flooding. Now what? What do you do? What are the efforts that the community is doing to restore those wetlands and remove some of those toxic sites? We also work together to create a policy fact sheet to take this research and put it in a format that's accessible and usable and concise for both community advocates and policymakers. And I'll pass it back.
We wanted to just highlight some of the key findings so far. And I just actually chatted everybody a copy of the methods document, which you can also download on the website, but it gives a lot of details that we won't have time to get into today. So next slide, please. So our basic research questions were: how many and what types of hazardous sites and facilities are potentially threatened by overland flooding due to sea level rise? And then who will be impacted, and what are the characteristics of the populations that are living close to these at-risk sites? Next slide, please. So our initial approach, with a lot of consultation and back and forth, as Lucas described, with the Toxic Tides Advisory Committee, was to integrate data that was available nationally on diverse types of hazardous site locations. This entailed integrating 4 national databases from US EPA, the Facility Registry Service dataset, the Energy Information Administration, data from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and Everest, which provides information on active oil and gas well sites. And then we looked at flood risk projections. This was in collaboration with Climate Central, which has developed and published a lot on sea level rise and flooding projections, both in the US and globally. We integrated both low and high emission scenarios for 2 time frames, 2050 and 2100 time horizons. And on the website, you'll see that we provide estimates for an ensemble average and best and worst case sea level rise projections. And then as a result of feedback after we presented our results in December, we have added an additional tab that provides extreme scenarios of around 6 feet and 10 feet sea level rise projections, as well as we were able to acquire groundwater data from the US Geological Survey to integrate that. So that's a new separate tab as a result of excellent conversations from other community-based organizations, as well as agency folks in response to our initial release. And then we integrated population vulnerability metrics drawing from US Census data, the American Community Survey, also affordable housing databases, information on voter turnout in California, and then of course, indicators of disadvantaged communities based on CalEnviroscreen. Next slide, please. So for the high emission scenario, ensemble mean sea level rise projections for 2100, basically in a nutshell, we estimate for 2100 about 425 facilities are at risk of major surface flooding, sea level rise based on seawater flooding only. And you can see the different types of categories that we examine. So everything from power plants, concentrated animal feeding operations, sewage treatment facilities, toxic release inventory, landfills, cleanup sites, refineries, ports and terminals, and then active oil and gas wells in the state. And we base this on basically facilities that were in counties that were within 3 kilometers of the 10-meter elevation above the current high tide line. That was sort of the total number of facilities that we included in this analysis. Next slide, please. And you can see here, again, a map of the counties in California where we're likely to have the largest number of facilities. And then this pie chart here gives you a sense of the breakdown of the kinds of facilities in terms of the 425 that are at risk of major surface flooding. And you can see that overwhelmingly, many of these are active industrial facilities based on the toxic release inventory, but also oil and gas wells, as well as sewage treatment facilities, and also landfills and hazardous waste treatment and disposal facilities. Next slide, please. For the San Francisco Bay Area, we also have regional breakdowns, which you can also take a look at in these maps. We anticipate about 238 sites that are at risk of major flooding risk by 2100. And you can see, our shoreline, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's a lot of beautiful nature on those areas, but also there's been a lot of industrial development there, and many of these are active industrial sites, as well as sewage treatment facilities and hazardous waste and treatment disposal facilities, as well as cleanup sites. And you can see the breakdown by county. And then next slide, please. If we look at who bears the burden, this is a chart that shows by block group the number of facilities. So going from 0 facility, if you look at the chart on the left, going from 0 facilities to block groups that have 5 or more facilities. This is looking at the proportion of residents in those block groups on average. And you can see that on the left-hand side, in general, as the number of at-risk facilities goes up, the proportion of people living below the poverty line tends to increase. And with the chart on the right, similarly, you can see that as the number of at-risk facilities increases, the proportion of residents of color also increases. Next slide, please. So then we wanted to look at many other indicators. And so this is just kind of a snapshot of some of the main ones that we analyzed. And you can see that in general, there's a higher likelihood of an at-risk site within 1 kilometer among disadvantaged communities, as defined by CalEnviroScreen. So about 6 times higher odds of having an at-risk facility in disadvantaged communities. And then if you continue on, next slide. You can see that the at-risk locations also tend to have higher proportions of low voters not voting. Again, people living below the poverty line, lower rates of home ownership, higher proportions of people of color, more linguistically isolated households is associated with a higher odds of living near these at-risk facilities. Next slide, please. So we are developing and finalizing a manuscript for publication, but the main product from this project has been our online mapping tool. And we held a series of workshops at the end of last year, regional workshops, as well as one statewide workshop to present these preliminary results and on the mapping tool. And then we also solicited feedback from diverse audiences. And so what you're seeing here is kind of an updated version of our online mapping tool as a result of months of conversations with agency folks, as well as other community organizations that are working on site-specific areas, for example, in the Bay Area. And so we added an additional tab here to look at extreme scenarios, which we encourage you to take a look at. But this is the landing page for our online mapping tool. Next slide, please. So this is a GIF showing you how you can look and find out about the at-risk facilities in your neighborhood. So you can, go on to a site with a particular color that corresponds to a particular category, click on it, and then takes you right to the facility, the EPA data set on that facility. You can also find out the number of people that live near that facility and other information. Next slide, please. The site also lets you look at, by neighborhood, the number of projected at-risk facilities by the neighborhood. And again, looking at the 2050 and the 2100 projections, the number of facilities and the number of people that are potentially impacted who live nearby. Next slide, please. And then you can also look at neighborhood demographics, choosing different indicators that are of interest to you. Again, by neighborhood, the gray dots indicate the facilities that are at risk of flooding based on these projections. And you can look at all different kinds of demographic indicators of interest. Next slide, please. So with the extreme scenarios tab and integrating groundwater encroachment, again, we created a separate tab. These extreme scenarios are kind of a yes/no outcome as opposed to a probability outcome, which is what we had on these other maps that I just showed you. So looking at the same number of facilities in our analysis that include the counties within 3 kilometers of 10-meter elevation, if we look at medium risk aversion, which estimates about 7 feet of sea level rise, these are what we would project in terms of the number of facilities that are at risk just from sea level rise. And then if we look separately at groundwater encroachment, we would add another around 200 facilities. And then if we do the extreme high risk aversion scenario, which estimates 10 feet of sea level rise, this is the number of facilities that could be at risk of flooding. And then looking at groundwater encroachment separately, 182. Next slide, please. And then this is the GIF sort of showing you what that map looks like when you're looking at the extreme scenarios tab. This is in Southern California. And then you can look separately at facilities that are at risk of related to sea level rise flooding, and then You can also, the triangles represent the facilities that are going to be impacted by groundwater encroachment based on the USGS groundwater data, which is only unfortunately available for California right now. Okay, next slide, please. So basically the takeaways are using the ensemble averages, where the projections are that there are about 425 hazardous sites are at risk of surface flooding by 2100. If we apply kind of the very extreme high adverse risk scenario, we would be adding over an additional 500 at-risk sites. Disadvantaged communities and EJ communities are more likely to be impacted by these projections, and these projections are likely to be underestimates in terms of that they don't necessarily capture all types of risk from sea level rise. It's not an exhaustive list of all potentially hazardous sites because we are relying on national data sets because we are going to be scaling this up nationally. And there's always imprecise information about the extent of these and the full geographic boundaries of these facilities. So we could be underestimating the severity of some of these particular sites. But we are now moving on to extending our analysis to low-lying areas nationally. Next slide.
Great. So I'll be closing us up on the presentation with just sort of the last set of outcomes from this project, in addition to the mapping tool itself and the study findings. We also wanted to share sort of what's since disseminating the findings, what sort of we've been working on. So these will be sort of some of the recommendations for action slides. And just to say, the recommendations that we have developed as an extension of the Toxic Tides project really were informed by a robust community sort of outreach and engagement process, particularly with the sort of a broad suite of stakeholders. So as Rachel alluded to, we held 4 online workshops with over 350 attendees in total. That included 1 statewide launch event of the Toxic Tides project, including a briefing with state and regional agency staff, legislative offices, and statewide advocates. We also held 3 regional workshops after that statewide launch to really focus in on the 3 regions that the community partners are working in. So the Bay Area, Central Coast, and Southern California. And there we really focused our audience with sort of local and regional advocates and decision makers. And sort of everything that was surfaced, including feedback, but also discussion around how this research and quantitative results can actually be informative to policy, form the foundation of our policy fact sheet, which we can share in the chat at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So this is just the visual of that policy fact sheet we developed that highlights sort of the applications. And again, we really, for us as advocates, it was really important that this research not just be sort of published for scientists, but actually be really shaping and actively informing many different policy dialogues and sort of legislation, regulatory action that's already in motion and for the future years. So there's a lot here. Again, yeah, Rachel just shared it in the chat, but a lot of richness that came out that we want to just highlight for you all today. Next slide. So the first sort of category of statewide opportunities that we would like to see this research inform broadly is encapsulated by state level planning and policy action. So we name explicitly in our policy fact sheet agencies like the Coastal Commission, the Coastal Conservancy, the Ocean Protection Council, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, as just a few of the state agencies that really have authority over many of the decisions that could this research would closely inform. And we make the call that these agencies need to make concerted efforts now to really minimize the health risk from future flooding for EJ communities. So more concretely, some of the sort of actions we uplift are: one, thinking about ways to incorporate this data around climate vulnerability, specifically sea level rise vulnerability and its intersections with toxics exposure, into the vulnerable communities mapping platform that the Office of Planning and Research is developing currently, and we know is underway this year. And just to make sure that these updated findings are being incorporated and integrated into that holistic platform. We also name specific actions around the way regulatory agencies can hold industry accountable and financially liable to minimize sort of harm from toxic exposure due to sea level rise, as well as ways to inform land use policies and permitting processes. And we finally named the real need to immediately clean up legacy toxic sites and develop sort of cleanup guidelines, especially for sites that are at risk of flooding due to sea level rise, as highlighted in our report. And there's clearly sort of more guidance and targeting that's needed around making sure that the communities living near these legacy sites are protected in the immediate term. Next slide. We also have a category of recommendations around targeting funding and resources. And so we hope that this mapping can help sort of inform funding decisions, both at the state and federal levels, around coastal infrastructure projects, site remediation, adaptation planning, and other projects. And we do name the importance of authentic community partnerships with CBOs to really co-create the strategies agencies are taking to sort of target resources, rather than sort of being reached out after funding's already been allocated to projects. So really wanting to see that co-ownership and partnership happening in the process of making decisions. We also name in this section climate-related health impacts and needing sustained funding for local health departments and community-based organizations to continue to assess, prepare for, and reduce climate-related health impacts, including those identified by toxic tides. Next slide. Something that really came up during the workshops is needing improved coordination across both state agencies as well as community stakeholders, and that the lack of coordination around sort of sea level rise projections and also responsive has really hindered proactive efforts to address these risks due to differing priorities, differing authority, funding parameters, et cetera. So we encourage agencies to undertake more cross-sector planning to ensure that both across scale, so that local, state, and federal agencies are coordinating, but also facility owners, landowners, and community groups can also come together to implement solutions collaboratively. And we also name the collaboration needing across state agencies, especially given that there's sort of different, as I mentioned, authority around who's responsible for site cleanup and industry regulation, which is really complicating overall oversight and the need to better streamline site cleanup that are at risk for sea level rise and flooding. Next slide. And I'm gonna, for this last set of recommendations around additional research and data, pass it back to Rachel.
Yeah, so I think as our conversations around the website occurred after our workshops, it's become clear that we're always seeking to improve and acquire better and integrate better data when it becomes available in terms of projections of risk stemming from multiple sources of flooding and multiple sea level rise scenarios. So there's a lot of concern about groundwater encroachment And initially that data were not available. That now there's some data out there, and while it's crude, it's, you know, something that can at least begin to improve and add additional you know, estimates and nuance. And then I think the other challenge is just inclusion of additional sites in California where hazardous substances are likely to occur that are not necessarily included in national data sets. And so providing opportunities to integrate different projects that are drilling down, if you will, into different types of potentially hazardous sites. For example, legacy toxic sites, there's a lot of work and very good mapping work going on that's specific to the Bay Area. And so where there's potentially opportunities to integrate these multiple projects together because they're highly complementary and together can, I think, give people an even more clear picture of the potential hazards. Next slide. And again, let's see. I think a screening tool like the one we have developed in conjunction with other projects that others have led can also help us highlight places that may be falling under the regulatory radar screen because maybe there isn't a lot of community organizing capacity in those locations, but there may be significant challenges there that become more apparent when you develop these tools. And that can also highlight the need for more spatially refined and very case and site specific estimates about where contaminants might move in the event of sea level rise related flooding and groundwater encroachment. So I think, you know, we want these large scale screening tools need to be complemented by, you know, ground truthing, if you will, to get at site specific environmental justice assessments for high risk sites that really involve concerned communities, and that also conduct outreach to those communities that may not necessarily be completely aware or organized in the same way that, for example, communities in the Bay Area have been. And I think the other huge need is that we want to convey this research and what we're doing about it in multiple languages. Next slide. And I think that's it. This is the website. Please check it out. You can email us questions and comments directly. The feedback that we have gotten in the first iteration has been extremely helpful. So yeah, we would love to continue hearing from you. And that's it.